Good evening, everybody. Good evening. On behalf of Dean Pam Riggs-Galasco and the College of Arts and Sciences Access and Inclusive Excellence Committee, thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Nicolasa Tejero. I am an Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences and serve as the liaison to the college's Access and Inclusive Excellence Committee. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Spotlight on Faculty Excellence. Now in its fourth year, this series recognizes and celebrates the remarkable achievements and professional contributions of our faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences. Before I go on with my remarks, I'd like to introduce you to the members of the committee who are present here today. So if I may ask Angie Toe and Edwin Murillo just to stand up or give a wave or something. I just wanted to recognize our committee members, and I wanted to give a special thanks to Mackenzie Marlowe, who is the Dean's assistant, for all of the work that she has done to help the committee bring this event to be. You can do you do that one, or stand up or something. That's Mackenzie. Before we go any further in tonight's celebration, I would also like to take a moment to honor the memory of two beloved members of our committee and UTC community who passed away in the past 2 weeks. Professor Gay Jeffers from the theater department, who died on March 5th after battling a long illness, and Dr. Gail Isles, who passed away unexpectedly on March 14th. Professor Gay Jeffers joined the faculty of UTC's theater department in 2007. An award-winning playwright, director, dramaturg, and teacher, Professor Jeffers taught courses in playwriting, directing, and theater history, and she also directed over 30 plays while at UTC. Whether in the classroom, the stage, or in the community, she championed issues of social justice. Gay used her skills, craft, and agency to make a positive impact on those around her. She pushed her students and colleagues to create better theater and challenged her audiences to confront difficult truths. In the Access and Inclusive Excellence Committee, Gay was a consistent and thoughtful contributor to our work. Dr. Gail Isles joined the criminal justice faculty in the Department of Social, Cultural, and Justice Studies in 2006. Since then, she distinguished herself as a prolific scholar and was recognized as an expert in the area of courts and sentencing. Dr. Isles was a dedicated teacher and mentor, determined to support her students academically and professionally. Her commitment to her community was evident in her service on the Hamilton County Community Corrections Advisory Board, the Tennessee Immigrants and Refugee Rights Coalition, and the Big Brothers Big Sisters of Greater Chattanooga's Board of Directors. In 2023, the Access and Inclusive Excellence Committee honored Dr. Isles' many accomplishments and contributions by naming her as the honoree of the second Spotlight on Faculty Excellent event. Since then, Gail has continued her contributions by joining the Access and Inclusive Excellence Committee, offering her compassion and expertise to our work. Though our loss is great, Gay's and Gail's legacies endure through the lives they touched, the programs they shaped, and the countless students and colleagues who benefited from their talents, wisdom, courage, and kindness. Tonight, we honor their memory as we celebrate excellence. I ask you to please join me in a moment of silence to remember our colleagues. Thank you. Tonight's honoree is Dr. Amy Warren, UC Foundation Professor of Psychology. After earning a PhD in experimental psychology from Georgia Institute of Technology in 1984, Dr. Warren joined UTC's psychology department faculty, where, over a 40-year career, she has exemplified a commitment to inclusive excellence through her teaching, scholarship, and service. In her nomination letter, her colleague, Jill Shelton, described Dr. Warren's role in transforming her department's culture to foster inclusion, access, and engagement of students and faculty from marginalized backgrounds. She also wrote, and I quote, "Dr. Warren's commitment to inclusive excellence, coupled with her expertise in child psychology, afforded her the opportunity to make remarkable contributions to UTC, Chattanooga, and the scientific communities." Dr. Warren's accomplishments are substantial. They include authoring 50 peer-reviewed publications, giving 146 presentations at academic conferences, and securing over $6 million in externally funded grants for her interdisciplinary research on inclusive pedagogical practices. Dr. Warren has engaged in the community by leading workshops and training programs for local teachers to promote school readiness and success for students from marginalized backgrounds, including children with disabilities and those whose primary language is not English. Moreover, she has served as a board member or consultant for community organizations including the Chattanooga Autism Center, the Chattanooga Police Crisis Intervention Training Task Force, United Way of Greater Chattanooga, UTC Children's Center, the Chattanooga Children's Advocacy Center, and the Creative Discovery Museum, among many, many, many other accomplishments. We could be here all night. So, her commitment to helping her community was recognized by UTC when Dr. Warren received the Carolyn Thompson and Roger G. Brown Community Engagement Award. She also earned the Patricia Draper-Aubert Distinguished Teaching Professor designation. Tonight, we are proud to honor her at our spotlight on faculty excellence. Would you please help me welcome to the podium Dr. Amy Warren.
Thank you to the committee, to my nominator, Dr. Jill Shelton, and also special thanks to members of my department for their support, the Autism Center, the Mosaic Program, pretty much everybody else that has supported me along the way throughout my career, and particular thanks to some of my former students whose work I will talk about some tonight, and to the many colleagues who are no longer with me in our department, particularly Nikki Osbeck, who has been a substantial contributor to this work as well. So how do I talk about 40 years of research and advocacy for vulnerable witnesses in 30 minutes? It's going to be like one of those drug commercials, but here we go. So I started, as she mentioned, I started at UTC in 1984. Shortly afterwards, I had the opportunity to go to a summer social policy institute that was sponsored by the Society for Research and Child Development. And we spent 2 weeks on the UT Austin campus, sequestered, dealing with all kinds of ways that child development research is applied to policy. And one of the modules was on children as witnesses. And that was at a time when there were several high-profile daycare abuse cases going on. And this was in the 1980s and early 90s, and a number of those cases were pretty egregious in terms of the way those children had been questioned. And so we weren't sure what, if anything, actually happened. So a lot of work at that time was on memory development and how that impacted children's ability to testify, but I knew that children's language development was equally important in their ability to tell their stories. So I started working on how children's language skills apply to questioning and courtroom testimony, preparing children to be questioned and for courtroom testimony, training interviewers and attorneys in how to question children. And then as my research program was growing and my family was growing, our field was growing, and we started thinking about, well, what about other vulnerable witnesses? It's not just children. And adolescents have their own unique challenges. They have strengths, they have grown, they have different needs, but they have new challenges that come about when they are more likely to be suspects in crimes as well as victims. And then autistic adults have unique challenges when it comes to dealing with the legal system. So I began work on preparing adolescents or their parents for interviews or interrogations, training police officers, attorneys, judges, juries, and most of all, that has led me to my recent work in changing the system to support vulnerable witnesses. So we're going to be talking tonight about moving from teaching the rules to changing the rules. There's so many rules when it comes to language. There are unwritten rules, there are rules that are explicitly taught, there are rules that you just have to pick up as you go along, all kinds of rules, some of them totally inane when you think about it. And then when you get to the legal system, more rules, more arcane, more complicated. And so how do these intersect? The first issue that I addressed when I began my research career was looking at competency to testify, because in the past, children would not be allowed to testify in court due to some just arbitrary age cutoffs. It was just like, no one can do this until they're 12 or 7 or 14. And now most states allow children to testify, especially if it is about an event that they directly experienced. So in abuse cases, they are almost always allowed to testify. But the issue is that really empowering for children? Does it achieve justice, or is it in fact traumatizing? On top of that, even if they're allowed to testify, their competency may be challenged. And the 4 elements of competency that they take into account: are they capable of perceiving and recalling events, understanding and answering questions, understand the difference between truth and lying, understand the obligation to speak the truth. And all those depend on how we ask them. So let's talk about language in the legal context. First, of course, there's the vocabulary. It's legal jargon. You all know this from dealing with contracts or insurance documents or whatever. In the legal context, we've got defendant, we've got testify, oath, swear, indicate instead of show. We have even more complicated terms than that. Just the term abuse may not be something that children understand. And one of my earliest studies in this field, we asked children to define and talk about their legal knowledge, and we got answers like, jury is something you wear around your neck, which is not that necessarily far off the mark. Court is a place to play basketball, and swearing is a bad word. So no, I'm not going to swear to tell the truth, right? Grammar, this is even worse. Legalese, complex question forms that attorneys are trained to use, particularly when they're cross-examining, because they are trying to trip you up, okay? Pragmatics, that's the social aspects of interviewing or interrogation or courtroom testimony. So when it comes to grammar, I love these examples. This is from a 9-year-old who someone tried to abduct her in a car. And she was testifying, and she was asked, you don't know if any of your brothers or sisters, or if I was your brother, well, any of your brothers or sisters didn't really tell what happened, didn't quite tell the truth once. You don't know of any of that happening in your family. Or prior to seeing Mr. B in his front yard on that day, and the individual in the car, did you ever see Mr. B get into his car before that or get out of his car? Okay. I have no idea what these questions were really about, so big surprise, children do not understand legalese. And in a study that was done by one of my longtime colleagues and her students, Nancy Walker Perry, they asked kindergartners, fourth graders, ninth graders, and college students to watch a very short video about a little girl building a block tower and an adult coming in and knocking that tower down angrily. They asked them a series of simple questions or legalese questions about that video. Legalese might include a double negative, and you may know this from watching court on TV. Did Sam not say that he was not having a good day? Multi-part questions. At the end of the video, was Sam mad, which was a yes, or was Katie happy, which was a no? So how do you answer that? Complex syntax. At any time before or after she cried, did the blocks fall down? Big surprise. The performance was pretty abysmal for the legalese type questions. If you asked simplified questions, then things were fine. Even the kindergartners could answer around 70% of the simple questions correctly. Every other age group was up to about 90% correct on the simplified questions. But on the multifaceted questions particularly, the college students were actually the worst, right? Complex syntax, college students are at about 75%. Double negatives, college students are at 40%. So no one is really understanding these complex questions. When we get to social pragmatic rules of language, again, in everyday conversations, we have all kinds of rules, and with the social setting, they're mostly unspoken. They're not necessarily directly taught. We take turns. We don't interrupt. We provide relevant answers. We stay on topic. We use the right amount of information, which I call the Goldilocks rule. Not too much, not too little. We adjust our speech to our listeners. So, for example, if we're talking about a party that we went to, we don't start saying, and then he did this. They don't know who he is. We adjust our language based on our listener's status. So, I might say something like to Nikki, to the dean, I might say, it's really warm in here, right? Whereas I might say to one of my friends, I might say, would you mind, turning down the thermostat? Or to my husband, I might say, turn down the thermostat. And he would say, you do it yourself, I can't read it, right? And if I said one of those very indirect ones, like, it's really warm in here, children are not going to understand that. Autistic individuals are probably not going to respond to that because they're very literally like, yeah, it is warm in here, or no, it's not warm in here. What's your point? Okay, so autistic children particularly are at a disadvantage here, but children in general don't necessarily know these rules, and even if they do know these rules, they may not understand when an adult is violating them. So we violate these rules all the time. We do it in classrooms. We ask students the questions to which we already know the answer, right? And so they can be accustomed to that instead of accustomed to being the one that needs to relay the information. So, instead, we need to teach children the ground rules for an interview or for testifying. So we need to Explicitly tell them. You can say, I don't understand. You can say, I don't know. You can ask me to repeat any question you don't understand. I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. You need to tell me what you remember. You can correct me if I get something wrong. I may ask a question again. That doesn't mean you gave me the wrong answer the first time. I'm just trying to understand what you told me. And answer with everything you remember that really happened. Sounds great, right? And we had several studies that we did boost performance, children's performance, somewhat, but not much, particularly if they were young. So they really only work well with older children who didn't even need that much help to begin with. And children don't know that they don't understand. So in that same legalese study I told you about, they were very poor at rating if they understood the questions and knew the answers. So before they were actually asked to answer, they were told, hit the green button if you know what the question means and you know the right answer. And then they hit green if they understood the question and knew the answer. They hit yellow if they weren't sure. They hit red if they didn't know what the question meant or that they knew they did not know the answer. Kindergartners were only correct in estimating that when they said they understood the question and they knew the answer, they were only right 55% of the time. So almost half the time, they didn't know that they didn't understand. That went up to about 75% for the older individuals, right? Kind of scary that even the college students were only at about 75%. The other thing was that they rarely answered, I don't know. So only about 15% of the kindergartners, it went up to a high of 25% for the ninth graders, would answer questions with, I don't know. And besides that, if we're training children to say, I don't know and I don't understand, what does that make them look like to a jury? It can undermine their competency and credibility. So what are we doing? Why are we placing all the responsibility on children for the language that we are using? That's why we need to change the rules. So we train interviewers, attorneys, judges to use age-appropriate language. It's more easily said than done because training, as most of you know, requires practice. It requires feedback. We need to videotape so that we can show people what they did and what they could do instead the next time. Require attorneys to rephrase difficult questions. That can be done, and in some countries it is required that a judge will say, you need to rephrase that question and ask it again. You can educate juries on children's language and memory abilities to give them a better understanding of why they might be performing the way that they do in the interview or on the stand. We can have expert witnesses if it comes to that, where they can also talk about the aspects of children's testimony, or the judge can give the judicial instructions themselves, and in some countries they do. In fact, I know Sarah was just in New Zealand. New Zealand's one of the countries where they have judicial instructions about child witnesses, okay? So, again, as the field grew, as my own child grew up, and I started seeing how these issues applied to older children and to autistic individuals, I moved into studying interrogations and confessions. And you've all heard something about the case of the Central Park Five, for example, which was in the late 1980s as well, sort of the same time frame as some of these big daycare abuse cases. Brendan Dassey, if you watched Making a Murderer, and if you paid any attention to the one episode where they focused on his interrogation, it's just chilling. because in all these cases, these interrogations were very lengthy, very suggestive, very coercive, and denials were just completely skipped over. They were all told that, they knew they were involved, they knew where they were lying, and that it would just go better for them if they confessed. All of the Central Park Five, except for one, confessed. They were all convicted, even though there was no physical evidence, and they spent a combined 41 years in prison before being exonerated because the actual criminal was, he was actually in prison with one of the Central Park Five and met him at Rikers. This was a 16-year-old who was sent to the adult prison at Rikers and ran across Mateus Reyes, who was the actual rapist and would-be murderer. And he confessed, and when they did a DNA, they matched it. And so 41 years between the five of them, and they were eventually awarded $41 million, which doesn't make up for their lost youths. So why do individuals falsely confess? Well, first, let me give you the statistics on it. Again, this is really chilling. This is from the National Registry of Exonerations. This is a database that started in the late 80s, and this is only for individuals who were wrongfully convicted, and they have now been completely exonerated. In many cases, this is DNA. In other cases, it is other evidence that, in some cases, like the prosecutors actually withheld evidence that would have exculpatory evidence in the beginning, all kinds of reasons. But this database has the cases, has the ages that were involved, the type of case, and it also has information that kind of tags why did they get wrongfully convicted. And one of those tags is a false confession. If they're 18 or older in the database, about 10% of them have that tag as being a wrongful confession. A false confession was one of the things that got them convicted. If they're under 18, that jumps to 34%. So a third of the cases involving under 18-year-olds involved a false confession. If they're younger than that, the rates go up even higher. 16 or 17-year-olds, it's 27%. 14 and 15-year-olds, 54%. Under 14 years old, 78% are in there because of a false confession. I should mention that if you also take mental illness or an intellectual disability into account, then those numbers actually go up to 79% of under 18-year-olds with either mental illness or an intellectual disability falsely confessed. So why are they falsely confessing? Pressures or coerciveness of the interrogation process. They're in physical custody, they're isolated, the interrogation techniques are extremely coercive in the US. We use a very accusatorial interrogation method typically. It includes maximization, which is implied threats, negative consequences, over-exaggerating evidence, and false evidence ploys. Yes, it's legal to lie to children in an interrogation. And it can be something from, you failed the polygraph, and I know you're lying. I know you did it. You just need to tell me what happened. You failed the voice stress analysis test. You failed the humidity test, which doesn't exist, by the way. The humidity test that showed us that you showered off the blood, okay? It can be that your friend told us already. Your friend already confessed and told us you did this when they did not. So there are a whole host of ways that they can legally lie and present this false evidence. The false evidence ploy is the single most problematic technique that's associated with false confessions. But overall, this package, which includes minimization, it's almost like the good cop side of this, minimization, providing moral justification, like, I understand why you did what you did. Anybody might do that in your situation, and it's going to be okay. You're basically a good kid. You just need to, own up to this. And then they can also kind of promise or imply leniency. If you just confess, then we'll go easier on you, which they can't do. They're not the ones who make the charges. They're not the ones who decide on the sentence. Right? When in research looking at known false confessions, this is not in terms of actual legal situations, but in like cheating, a paradigm that we use for allegations of cheating and some other techniques that we use with college students primarily, when they used an accusatorial technique like this, it increased false confessions 340%. It did not increase true confessions, okay? So this is an enormous problem that juveniles are in no way equipped to handle. The fatigue that can be involved. In the case of the Central Park Five, it was up to 30 hours of interrogation. And they were largely very late at night, wee hours of the morning, few breaks, not necessarily much sleep, not necessarily much food. And we see the same thing in terms of looking at the individual factors that would be involved in false confessions. Juveniles and some neurodivergent individuals are more willing to take risks, are more impulsive, less able to regulate emotions, more susceptible to the influence of other people. It sometimes is peers. In the case of juveniles, it may be adults. More compliant with authority figures, more vulnerable to external pressures, including fatigue. Less future-oriented, meaning you value short-term consequences like getting out of here, getting to go home, more than you're thinking about the long-term consequences that you could be locked up for life. So, any of you guys that work with autistic individuals, or you are neurodivergent yourself, let's say you have ADHD, do you recognize some of these characteristics? What would you do in this situation? So it would be great if juveniles knew their Miranda rights and would invoke their Miranda rights, because then maybe they would not talk to the police in those circumstances, but they are highly likely to waive their rights. 90% of the time, juveniles waive their rights because they have a poor understanding of their rights. And it's worse if they are younger. So younger than 15-year-olds or with any sort of intellectual learning or language disability, it's even worse. Part of the problem is the complexity of the Miranda warning itself, which you would not believe varies widely across jurisdictions. There are no national standards. There are no state standards. It can vary even from officer to officer in terms of how it is delivered. And especially, I have seen in a number of cases that I've looked at, whether it is actually treated seriously. In some cases, I have seen where they say, this is just a formality. So here are your rights, okay? In some cases, it is read aloud to them. In some cases, they have to read it themselves. In some cases, it's really, really long. In other cases, it's shorter. So it's just all over the place. And I'm sure you all know your rights, right? Okay, from listening to Law and Order, at least. But did you remember the last one? So it's the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. But did you know the last part? You can invoke these rights at any time. So you can change your mind. Even if you didn't invoke them right away, if things start going bad in the interview or the interrogation, you can say, well, wait a minute, I want to stop. But realize you have to say, I want to stop, I want a lawyer. It's not enough to say, I think I want a lawyer. I think I want to talk to my parents. That's not good enough, okay? So what about if we simplify the language of the Miranda warning? You have the right to remain silent, which means you don't have to say anything. It's okay if you don't want to talk to me. If you do want to talk to me, I can tell the juvenile court judge or adult court judge and probation officer what you tell me. You have the right to talk to a free lawyer right now. That free lawyer works for you and is available at any time, even late at night. That lawyer does not tell anyone what you tell them. That free lawyer can be with you if you want to talk with me. They can help you decide if it's a good idea to answer questions. If you start to answer my questions, you can change your mind and stop at any time. I won't ask you any more questions. But, again, there are problems with teaching the rules and the rights. Simplified Miranda warnings also vary in length, readability, vocabulary, grammatical difficulty, and even though research says they do improve juveniles' ability to at least restate or recall the rules, they don't necessarily improve their real comprehension of their rights or their ability to actually implement their rights. And Miranda rights are not even required except for custodial investigations by police. So juveniles don't know that they are free to leave if they are not under arrest. And so they perceive that they are in custody and have to stay and talk. If they are questioned at school, which happens, or other settings by non-police, then no warnings are necessary. Now, if they're questioned by school resource officers, they should be, but it's kind of a very gray area if they say that they just want to talk to them, right? Okay, so a bigger problem, again, is with our accusatorial interrogation methods. The Reid technique is the most widely used interrogation training in the US. It's used with adults and juveniles, and they even have special training programs for how to use the Reid technique with juveniles for school personnel and SROs. And I say this with this very sarcastic tone because I took this training course, and it was a rehash of the adult training course with just some words about juveniles kind of thrown in. The first phase of the Reid technique is not an interrogation. It is a pre-interrogation interview that does not involve reading your rights. And in that pre-interrogation interview, you ask questions deliberately designed to increase anxiety and elicit behavioral indicators of truth and lying. But get this, behavioral indicators of lying include crossing your legs, averting your gaze, so not looking directly at the interviewer, shifting, fidgeting, twirling your hair, or putting your glasses on and off, the grooming mannerisms. Verbal indicators of lying are supposed to be hesitating before you answer, or giving a vague answer, or being evasive. And then if you are deemed deceptive or guilty, then you are subjected to a coercive interrogation explicitly designed to elicit a confession. So I'm sure you can see that the truth-lying indicators do not reliably distinguish truth from lies. Research shows this over and over and over again. These are not good indicators of deception. And in fact, Reed-trained officers do not have improved lie detection ability. They are still down there at 50% like most of the rest of us. Truth-lying indicators instead are just well-known stereotypes. The problem is juveniles and autistic individuals don't necessarily know those stereotypes, and so they don't know that they are behaving in a way that makes it look like they are lying. Lying indicators are more common in juveniles and autistic individuals, regardless of whether they are telling the truth or lying. So how many adolescents do you know that slouch, that don't look you directly in the eye, that fidget, that hesitate in answering, that do things to control their anxiety? But their anxiety is coming about not because they're guilty, it's coming about because of this interrogation. And the training, as I mentioned, it's not actually adapted for juveniles, even though they pay lip service to it, and they even say, well, you can adjust these techniques if you're dealing with somebody who, is developmentally delayed or, has some sort of signs of, a mental illness or, other kinds of issues. But they don't say how to do that. Reed-trained SROs, which are unfortunately pretty common because this Reed program is available online, and some school systems use it for professional development for their school personnel. Okay? They endorse using the same techniques for juveniles that are used on adults. So, juveniles rarely have an attorney present during questioning because they have waived their rights, or they were questioned before they were even read their rights. So could parents or other interested adults help? Well, that assumes that parents understand legal rights and procedures. And guess what? We don't. Adults also misunderstand Miranda rights. And in the studies where they have been involved in interrogations or they have been asked what they would encourage a child to do if they were involved in a situation, they encourage waiving their rights and cooperating with the police on the idea that if you are cooperative, then we will get this all sorted out and you will be allowed to go home. They also encourage confession a surprisingly large number of the time because they've got this dual role. And they're like, I want my kid to take responsibility for their behaviors, and so that's the right thing to do. Well, it kind of depends on what they're being charged with and if they really are guilty of doing that, which you do not know at this point. So, parents especially don't know enough about interrogation policies and procedures in their jurisdiction. And research shows that they assume they're going to be notified. They assume they're going to be asked to give permission before their kid is questioned, videotaped. They assume they're going to be allowed to sit in during questioning. And in many jurisdictions, they are not. I'm not surprised that parents do not know this, because I, as a parent, did not know this. And when I was doing research on this topic, and I asked a defense attorney, a juvenile court defense attorney, we asked somebody in the DA's office, we asked a couple of Chattanooga police CPD officers, and they gave me different answers about what our policies were, okay? So, and when I did a Google search yesterday, Google AI told me that the policy on juvenile interrogation for Hickson, Tennessee was, and it was wrong. It was wrong, okay? So, did I go ahead? Okay. No, I need to go back a slide. All right, so changing the rules. Teaching the rules is not enough. We need an attorney to be either present or they need to at least be consulted before an interrogation begins. And there are 5 states that now require this. This is since 2021, I think, this has begun. And this is not just for interrogations, this is for taking any plea deal, because most cases, I mean, if you know anything about juvenile court, rarely are these cases going to be in adult court. It depends on the seriousness of the crime. All those exoneration cases with those young kids were like murders, rapes, serious stuff that they confessed to doing when they did not, right? But most of the time, we're talking about, what we call technically a delinquent act, if it's a minor, not a crime. But they also take plea deals. And so they need help. We don't know what these plea deals mean. And so the parents or the guardians and the juvenile need help in determining whether they should do this. So we need to videotape interrogations in their entirety, because in the case of the Central Park 5, they only videotaped the part that included their confessions, okay? They also videotaped them being read their rights again at the end, after they have already, and then asked, do you understand, right? Well, Miranda rights are supposed to be made knowingly and voluntarily. That was not the case, okay? So, 30 states, and now finally Tennessee, as of July 2024, require videotaped interrogations. The law, though, is really kind of wishy-washy. It's like, we require it to be videotaped unless videotape is not working, and then it needs to be audio taped. Unless something went wrong with the equipment, and then, it's okay, but, do the best you can. All right. We need to change the rules to prohibit deceptive tactics, especially false evidence ploys or promises of leniency for confessing. And in 7 states, they have now either done that or they have made statements obtained using these techniques inadmissible in court. And beyond that, we need education for police. I mean, they've been trained this way. I'm not saying police are bad. They have been trained that this is the way you need to do it and that it works. We need training for judges, and, if none of that works out and these cases wind up in court, then we need expert testimony. So what's next? I'm off to, not Disney World, but okay. So I will be paying attention still to the research conducted. I mean, are these new policies, are these new laws working out? Are things getting better? And some of my former students and colleagues are doing this kind of work, and so I hope you will also kind of stay tuned for what's going on in this field. Advocacy efforts to change policies and laws, I will still be involved in that as well. But it's your turn. And I want to thank my colleagues at the Chattanooga Autism Center, the Mosaic program at UTC, the psychology department at UTC, and make a call for you to help in one specific way right now, which is the Chattanooga Autism Celebration Walk coming up April 12th. Our Awesome Mocks, UTC Awesome Mocks team is actually being led by Haley Weissenbach of the Mosaic program this year, and we are hoping to have our biggest team and raise the most funds we have ever raised, because some of the work that Autism Center does would directly impact this work on justice and access in the autism for the autism community and the legal system. I know Dr. Dave Buck, who is here, the executive director, does training for police on what happens when you interact with an autistic person and how to interpret and not escalate the situation. Haley Weissenbach has been involved in some of that with our campus police as well. So I would really appreciate your assistance on this, and otherwise, thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity, and continue to eat.
Have what, 7 states that you said?
Can I give you a mic?
Right, thank you. Okay. Unfortunately, we don't have all 50 states that are complying to some of these changes that you're asking for, but it's a start, right? And so a lot of the work that you and your colleagues have been doing have led to some positive changes, which is pretty amazing. So I think there's lots to talk about here. So this is the time for anyone who has questions for Amy about the work she's done or about what you can do to help make a difference.
Thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. I am blessed to be here. I also have a kid, and he goes to school. There's an SRO. What advice would you give us? Maybe like a tangible thing that we could ask at a PTO meeting or at a meeting with the principal to get a sense of what's permitted at an individual school and how you might advocate for change?
Really good question. And in fact, the law in Tennessee that was passed in July, or went into effect in July, on videotaping, actually follows from an earlier bill, House Bill, I think 720 or something like that, that was proposed by someone in Rutherford County. You may or may not have heard about the situation in Rutherford County when a whole bunch of little girls were arrested at school because they failed to stop a fight. One of them actually said stop. The others were accused of encouraging the fight, and there was videotape evidence of this, right? So these little girls were arrested at school. These are like, third graders, fourth graders, maybe one was sixth grade, taken to jail, and it was just so egregious. It turns out in Rutherford County, the number of arrests and juvenile detentions were 50% higher than any other county in Tennessee. And it was all because of the juvenile court judge's perspective on juvenile justice. So one of the Tennessee House representatives from Rutherford County was kind of tasked with how do we avoid these kinds of issues. And so he actually initially proposed what would be the gold standard bill. It would have included the videotaping, consulting with an attorney, making sure that the children's parents were called beforehand. I mean, the whole thing, everything that I have just been advocating for, didn't pass, didn't make it out of committee. And his big argument, because I actually watched some of the discussion on the House floor, and his big thing was, this cost my county $6 million because of the lawsuits and stuff. Like, that's what you care about? All right. So the issues in that case were so egregious. The police officers, there were 3 police officers that went out to arrest these little girls. The parents were not told in advance, and they told the school principal not to call the parents. One of the police officers was kind of on board with it. 2 of the police officers did not want anything to do with this, but they were basically forced to. The SRO from the school had heard that this was going to happen and called in sick, stayed home because he didn't want to be involved. He didn't want to be associated with this mess. So school resource officers are generally, particularly for elementary school, this is typically, it's a benign situation. In Rutherford County, that went awry that day. So typically, school resource officers shouldn't get involved in just minor disciplinary things, but when we're talking middle school and high school, they do. And things can escalate rather quickly, and this is part of the basis of the whole school to prison pipeline. So I think it is a legitimate question to ask, what is the role of the SRO? Are they really there to protect us, which, supposedly is the goal with the school shootings and so forth? To what extent are they involved in disciplinary practices? I mean, if somebody is not, physically harming someone else or threatening to, seriously harm someone else, then the SRO is probably not going to be involved in that, right? And they may have a much better relationship with the students, but it depends so much on kind of the county policies, the individuals that are hired to be the SROs, that, so yeah, legitimate question. Ask, what is the role of the SRO? Long answer, I'm sorry.
Hi, Amy.
Hi.
Well-deserved recognition. Thank you for being
Thank
here
you.
this evening. The Reed technique sounds invalid. So is there any way to use that as a means of throwing out the confession?
Not at this time, unfortunately. Same thing with like a polygraph. That's not admissible in court because it is not really reliable enough. It doesn't have the scientific backing, but they use it anyway before you get, so they won't admit it in court, but they'll use it and then, use it to manipulate the suspect beforehand. So that's kind of what the Reed technique is doing as well. And as an IO person, you should know that they do have a Reed technique for human resource managers. Figure out if your employees are committing fraud or lying or cheating or whatever. It's a huge money-making thing. The Reed technique, yeah. They have, I can't even tell you. Go to their website and you'll see Reed technique for this and that and everything else. And this has been going on since, I don't know, the late 40s, 50s, something like that. It is entrenched in the U.S. as opposed to a more information gathering technique that we see in many European countries, for example, that when researchers from the U.S. were called in to kind of help deal with the fallout from the 9/11 interrogations, the enhanced interrogations that were conducted that actually involved torture. Because those were justified because, we had to get this information because there were people that were actively, threatening to harm us. Well, it turns out that using the information gathering techniques reveals more information, actionable information that would help you thwart a terrorist threat than using torture. So, same thing. We're working on it. There are a number of people, number of researchers, psychological researchers that are collecting really strong evidence, including real world, what they call the high value detainee program. And some of our former students have been involved in that. So yeah, kind of exciting to see where that goes.
Hi, Dr.
Yes,
Warren.
Stafford, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? I'm kind of personally curious. I saw that you did a lot of research, and I know you're also particularly interested in language. And I'm wondering if there's any specific study that you did that really solidified an inkling for you, or just that you're like really particularly proud of. Is there any one or few studies that comes to mind that really was like, wow, we did that?
In this field, probably my first study at looking at actual child abuse interviews in Tennessee. So one of my former students, Carolyn Boyd, was a social worker, and she and I were, talking about how things go in the social work field, and she actually got access to, at the time it was only like 20 actual child sexual abuse interviews that, I didn't have the children's actual names or the suspects or any of that information, but I started looking because, everybody was talking about how terrible some of the interviews were in the McMartin preschool case or the Kelly Michaels case or some of those really terrible daycare abuse cases. And said, well, but those are not the norm, are they? So we started looking at Tennessee social worker interviews, and I analyzed them using the principles of what we know to be good interviewing techniques. I had other students that actually analyzed the language that was used, including counting the number of times since it had been, since an interviewer had said, all right, so Bob did this to you, right? And then how many times since they had said the name Bob, had they used the term he or, another pronoun, or it wasn't, and so when did they use Bob's name again? So it was clear that we were still talking about the same person, right? So really detailed, nitpicky kind of analysis to these interviews. And it kind of allowed me to tell my field that, one, the typical interviews are not that bad. They're not good, but they're bad in more of a awkward, kludgy, way that they may not be highly suggestive and coercive, but they're not doing a great job at letting children tell their own stories. One of my favorite examples, also horrifying, from that study was an interviewer was, following her little script. And so she started out saying, all right, so what do you know about the difference between the truth and a lie? And the child said, AG touched me. And the interviewer said, Jesus loves me? Is that what you said? And she said, uh-huh. And then they just went right on, okay? So, it was that kind of thing that I saw in these interviews, that they were really awkward. They asked a lot of very specific, yes/no questions that children don't answer with lengthy stories. They interrupted. They didn't allow children enough time. So if a child hesitated, they do like in a normal conversation where you just like kind of jump in and fill the silence. But that did allow me to, in my professional field, to say, okay, yes, some interviews can be highly suggestive and highly leading and manipulative, but everyday interviews are more likely to just be bad in a different way. And so here's what we need to work on if we're talking about investigative interviews. And we need to train people to start out with very open-ended questions. Even with young kids, we don't need to jump into, did somebody touch you there, right? Show me what he did. We don't need to do that. We need to wait. We need to allow children to tell in their own words as much as they can before we start asking specific questions. So, does that kind of answer your question? Okay. Yes, Jordan?
Hello, Dr. Warren. So good to see you.
At least you're not jumping out at me from under a table right now.
In April.
Okay.
I'll be there.
All right.
So, just kind of like piggybacking off of that, one of the things that I used to do when I was at Valley is take kids to the CAC to do their interviews.
Which is not the Autism Center.
The Child Advocacy Center. Yeah. And so with that, a lot of times the kids would come out with like drawings or, whatever. I would do trauma work. We would do a trauma narrative. Sometimes DCS would ask for a copy of that so they could take that to their team or to court. A lot of times the trauma narrative was not something that they could actually use in court, but there was like the evidence that, okay, this is the kids' work. So with that, I was wondering, are there any studies that kind of center around trauma and how that impacts testimony? Especially like a trauma narrative.
I don't know about a trauma narrative per se, but there are certainly some studies on how children who have been abused are not typical in terms of their language abilities and their testimony. And so there is a body of research on that. I will say on the other side, kind of problematically, when people, would do the drawings, show me what happened, show me on this diagram, body diagram, where you were touched or where you were hurt. The younger the kid, the less likely those are to be valid. Because the really young kids, they may need the most help in telling their story, but the drawings are not the way to do it. Because the kids don't understand that actually represents them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they're always like a character or something.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And so there's been some good research on that unfortunately, that was an idea that we had, and for a long time in the 80s and 90s particularly, we thought if we used anatomically correct dolls, they could act out what happened to them. No, they were acting out other things entirely. They were pretending, but they weren't necessarily acting out what happened to them. Yep. So it's a really challenging thing to do, especially with the youngest kids. But the best option we've got is to start out with as much as they can relay in their own words to start with. And then if you do start having to bring in props or drawings or more suggestive questions, you do that and you get more and more risky as you go along, with the understanding that the information you get at the end might be less reliable.
Oh, totally.
Okay? Yeah.
Thank you.
Probably time to go.
Can I ask you one question? Yes. So I feel like this is going to be a mic drop question for you. So, you're invited here because we're recognizing you on your commitment to inclusivity, not only in the court system, but for students from underrepresented backgrounds. And so we're facing a very difficult climate right now, and we now have an executive order in place where we're going to dismantle the Department of Education. That's the plan. So based on your expertise and what you know about the work that is being done by that branch of our government for students from underrepresented background, what are some potential consequences for inclusion and access to those students?
Yeah, this is devastating. Some of the work will probably go on in different departments. I'm hoping they're not going to dismantle the IDEA. Children with disabilities are just going to be devastated. I mean, we're already facing budget cuts. You've probably heard in Hamilton County, they're cutting special ed. It's going to be devastating. I don't think there's any doubt about it. My colleagues, Ann and Sarah, who we worked on those grants, particularly for children whose first language is not English. We worked on training our teachers to work with ESL populations. That seems to be going away. I mean, they've said that, we've declared English as the official language of the U.S. I wouldn't be surprised if they start, saying that we don't need to even print materials in other languages anymore. Yeah, it's looking pretty grim. I'm not sure I'm at a place right now that I have a whole lot of hope, but we need to write our representatives and call our representatives and make our feelings about this known, because there are a whole lot of people depending on the kinds of supports that the federal level needs to provide, because the idea that states are going to turn around and do all the things that the federal Department of Education has been doing is absolutely ludicrous. And the idea that we should just be left to our own devices is some states are going to do it well and some states are not going to do it well, and we'll see how it goes. I'm not willing to lose an entire generation of children to see how it goes.
Get out there and advocate, people.